British fishing vessels catch around 100,000 tonnes of fish each year in the EU waters, but EU vessels catch 700,000 tonnes in UK
British,
waters.
right. Take back control. That was the maxim during the referendum from Brexiteers, and the majority of fishermen were particularly keen to stress that they wanted control back over British waters. However, earlier this year, the EU requested that the UK remain part of the common fisheries system until at least 2021, when the transition phase will end. And the UK government agreed. The concern among the fishing industry now is that they could be used as a bargaining chip for better EU trade deals in areas that don't involve fish, therefore selling them down the river. Our guest of the day, George Eustice, is the Fisheries Minister. Bertie Armstrong from the Scottish Fishermen's Federation joins us from Aberdeen. Mr Armstrong, does it worry you now that you will remain part of the common fisheries policy until 2021?
Well, we weren't pleased that that's going to be the case for the implementation period, but regrettably that was probably always going to be the case. The one issue which unites everybody, politicians, the fishing industry, politicians of all shades, and the general public, is that we need fairer shares of the fish. 40% of the fish in our area are retained by our own fishing industry, 60% goes to the rest of the EU. The comparative figures in Iceland and Norway are 90% retained and 85% retained. That must change, and so there is the biggest imperative not to sell us down the river, or pick a cliche, and there's a specific economic reason. The last article, the last discussion talked about some numbers. The first sale of fish is about £1 billion in the UK. If you keep more than 40%, then the numbers are obvious. So here's an area for growth. Here's an area for managed expansion. Here's an area that needs to go right. And although it's a small proportion of GDP, it's not small in coastal communities and coastal areas that have suffered from 60% of their raw material leaving. So there's a very strong reason why this must not go wrong, and that we need to retain sovereignty over who catches what and where in our exclusive economic zone. It doesn't mean everybody leaves, but we have sovereignty and control over that. That is the sacrosanct central point.
Post 2021 is Britain to exercise sovereignty of its territorial waters and its waters that fishing policy is covered by international agreement, and that anybody else who's allowed to fish there would only fish on our terms and under our agreement. Is that right?
That's a succinct description of exactly what we want and exactly where we hope we're headed. Yes.
Well, let's stay with this because we have the Minister here. Is that what you're going to deliver?
Yes.
Tell us how.
We're very clear. If you look at Norway, Faroes, Iceland, they're what we call independent coastal states. It means you have responsibility for managing your own exclusive economic zone. That's out to 200 nautical miles or the median line. And as an independent coastal state, you decide the terms of access to your waters. And these are very well-trodden territory. We know what Iceland do. We know what the Faroes and Norway do. That's what we intend to do.
So we will still allow EU boats to fish in our waters, but on our terms. And the point Mr Armstrong was making is it's all about the scale of the catch. So what is our policy, British policy, going forward on this? How much will we allow EU boats to catch after 2021?
Well, one of the problems you have with the common fisheries policy is they have a principle called relative stability, which basically means they lock in everyone's share based on what it was in the late 70s. Over the last 12 months, we've been doing some detailed work on what's called zonal attachment. That's looking at where the fish basically reside. And as Bertie Armstrong said, the truth is the majority of them reside in our waters. And then we want a fairer allocation methodology based on zonal attachment.
And give us an idea of what you would regard as fair.
Well, at the moment, for instance, we know that British fishing vessels catch around 100,000 tonnes of fish each year in the EU waters, but EU vessels catch 700,000 tonnes in UK
British,
waters.
Right.
And we want a more balanced arrangement.
Right, but give us an idea of balance, because the fishing community is frightened, then it's clearly not on the cards that we just stop EU boats fishing in our waters. It's the extent of how much. And given you've extended the fisheries policy to 2021, they're clearly concerned that when it comes to the percentage EU boats will be allowed to take, you'll sell them out.
Well, I can understand why they're concerned about the transition period. We had argued for fisheries to be excluded, but the EU wouldn't budge on that. But the simple point I'd make, there's a big difference between reaching an agreement you're a little bit disappointed with for a period of 19 months and a long-term agreement.
But I'm asking about the long-term agreement.
Well, the truth,
That's
let
the
me just
key
explain.
issue. So tell us,
long-term,
how much will we limit the EU boats in British, if I can call it this, territorial waters?
Well, as with negotiations with Norway and Iceland and Faroes, there'll be an annual negotiation each December.
And trade. I mean, fishing is only 0.5% of our GDP, though. As Mr. Armstrong says, it matters in a number of our communities. But overall trade in goods matters much more. Services matter overwhelmingly more. The EU's position is, we'll give you a bit more in trade and services. You need to give us more in fishery policy. Why wouldn't you sell them out?
Because we don't agree with that position, and we don't
That's
need
the negotiation.
Well, it's what the EU is asking for. They would ask that, wouldn't they? They get £500 million worth of fish, bakshi, from the UK each year. But our position is that we want a free trade agreement that's comprehensive. The EU's got
So fishing is up for grabs.
No, the EU's got a trade deficit. So we've got a trade deficit with the EU.
EU's got a huge trade surplus.
They've got a huge trade surplus. So when it comes to trade, they need access to our
Well, let
markets.
me go.
I meet dairy producers in
Sure, no, let's stick with fish.
Denmark and everything else. They
Let's
need
stick
access to our
with
market.
fish for the moment, because Mr. Armstrong has
But my
been-
point is we don't need to give away
he's
fish
been
to get free
patiently
trade.
waiting there in Aberdeen. Let's go back to the Granite City. Are you reassured by what you've heard there or not?
There is a fight on. There are 40 lines of negotiation. Fishing is one of them. It will be a negotiation. So we recognize that there is some danger for us. But it's the right thing to do. It's simply the right thing to do. With regard to mixing trade and access to our waters, we don't say to the French, you can put wine on our supermarket shelves, but we would like some share of your grapes for that. That's absurd. But that's exactly what happens in fishing. And this line of argument, if you want to trade in our markets, you must give us some of your natural capital, is totally absurd. The critical path is sovereignty. As George Eustace said, the annual negotiation from a position of sovereignty over your own natural capital is where we want to be. You can then be as generous or as ungenerous as you like. So it's all about a direction of movement. It's all about a managed expansion of this really iconic, really important industry to a position in the end of world leadership. That's where Iceland and Norway stand. That's where we want to stand too, and the law supports us.
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we've got to go on towards Prime Minister's questions. Bertie Armstrong in Aberdeen, thank you for joining us.